we've had a couple of very long-term projects going on 3 years, and one of them we've replicated a study. So with the Cape Lake Compact on the Cape, it's a 100-home pilot that PA Consulting did a study on in 2008. The question is, to what degree were those kind of findings going to become persistent? So we replicated the study, and we found that people were saving on average 9%, and that were over 2.5 years logging in weekly on average, and that there was a correlation between those two. I think the other thing we found is that if you go back to the 1990 rule that I discussed on the web, we're seeing the same kinds of patterns on these websites. So even as we extend it to broader pilots, so we have a couple of these pilots are 400-ish users, what we're seeing is fairly high numbers in terms of 17% of people have posted information. Another 45% of people are reading that posted information. So what that means is when an end user actually shares some information, a comment, something they've done, and I'm going to show you that specifically, there are other people who are reading that as well as reading the rest of the information. The last thing is the emergence of champions in every pilot. And a champion is a user, it's a participant in the group that emerges as a lead user, meaning a very active user. And as lead users, they tend to be experts. They're very knowledgeable in the energy field, or they're people who are interested in providing both feedback and encouragement. And what's important about that role is that they become models for the rest of the community in terms of interest in energy and energy participation. And they're different from a utility spokesman. In that way, they are influential. And it's the same kind of pattern that we see on the web. So I want to show you an example. So this is what we call a snapshot. A user's posted a copy of their graph and an instance and made a comment about working with dimmable CFLs. And you can read through a little bit of it. But what's interesting is that there are 9 responses or comments to this additional post. And of that 9 responses, there's 7 different people who have posted a response, and that includes both the champion and our expert. So I'll let you look through those for a minute because it gives you an idea of the kinds of comments and interaction that actually happens on a utility energy website, and I think what we're going to start seeing in the future. So the second comment is from one of the champions, someone who comments a lot. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see a set of additional comments on that thread. One of them is from our expert, and one of them is from the additional poster. And it begins to give you a flavor of how people actually are willing to interact and post information, and how much they leverage the community or other people to answer questions. And the question here is about CFLs versus LEDs, and clearly that's a very timely question for kind of energy users.
Thanks very much. That was very helpful. We just heard Dr. Paul Cole of Tendril talking about applying behavioral science to customer engagement. Now we're going to turn to some of your questions. So I've got a question from William Paul, and he says, to claim savings from behavioral change, you need a formula like that for energy efficiency equipment. Do you have any ideas for how you verify and validate behavioral-based energy savings?
It's a great question. Typically, you want to have a control group. So you want to create a situation where you have a group that has the technology and a group that doesn't have the technology, maybe more than one group, and then you want to compare the outcome in terms of their savings over time between those two uses. And if you do that, you can, with much higher confidence, indicate or assume that the savings is based on the intervention, it's called, but the technology that's available.
That's helpful. Andrew asks if you have any thoughts on I call it the fallback phenomenon. When people get a comparative ranking, they see they're a leader, so they stop trying so hard, and their savings start to fall back towards the average. Anything they've done about that?
Yeah, that's another great question. What's important to understand is that there's no silver bullet to these things. What I talked about is a model that has 4 pieces, and that you really need the 4 pieces pulled together to create successful change. So what happens in our systems is that if people set a goal, they have a motivation to meet their goal even when they've seen that they may be higher than the norm. So both those components together kind of diminishes what you're calling it, what basically is a regression to the mean.
Well, Gia has a question, and I'll ask this of you first, Paul, and then maybe Gail want to chime in, because I think it's an issue for both vendors and for utilities. And she asked, for things like this, how do you handle emerging standards? And she references, Open ADR 2.0 as an example, but many of these things are in flux, and of course you want to be standards-based, but maybe we could start with you, Paul.
I think those standards are critical. So Tendril's position on that was we support all of the standards, as many of the standards as we can.
And I think Gia's question was, what about those ones that are really in flux, and what do? You do the earlier version or not at all, or do you wait, or what's the right time? Those are the kinds of questions I hear from a lot, and maybe Gail has a thought on that too, because I'm sure you guys wrestled with it at Kansas City Power and Light.
Right. I mean, one of the things is, we always kept thinking SAP 2.0 was going to be here by now, and we all know it's not here. And I think it was written in our grant that we were going to implement stuff with SAP 2.0. So, we started rolling our meters last October thinking, by the time we start giving the tools inside the customer's home, like the thermostats and, further advance that, we're going to be there. Well, guess what? It's not there. The standard's not there, and who knows where it's going. We're going to do the best we can, and pushing for the new standards, such as like the Open Access ADR 2.0. And I think the hardest part of implementing that was, we count and depend on a lot about strong relationships with our vendors, with each other. And that's one of the reasons why we chose Tendril, is because they are big on standards, and they're very good at working, having this open platform and ensuring that, when they work with our vendors, for example, Landis & Gyr, what is our meter vendor, they did a great job working back and forth together. Now, that's not to tell you that there were delays between Tendril and Landis & Gyr due to technical issues, which ultimately meant there was delays in our timeline. And we had to go to our executive sponsor team and tell them, hey, guess what? The thermostat's being delayed, because we really wanted to roll the thermostat out last year, but we had to delay it until this year. And then even so, as I mentioned, hey, guess what? We're not going to actually issue demand response events through the meter this year because we're still testing the technology. So it's been a challenge.
Judith has a question about some of these scores, and I think it's an interesting one. Paul, maybe this would be for you. Have you tested kind of personal achievement scores and metrics vis-a-vis comparative ones? Not everybody likes to be compared or likes to feel they're competing. And some people do like to set personal goals.
2 points. Yes, I think the goal setting when an individual sets their goals is pretty critical, and we've seen that as very successful, a real important motivator. We've had less success with other kinds of ranking systems, like a specific number, what level have you achieved. So in terms of an individual goal set, when people set their goals, I see that as a real critical metric for people. And some people have preferences towards that, and other people have preferences towards the comparative. That's why the integrated solutions tend to be most successful.
Terrific. Thank you, Paul, for that. And we have come to the end of our time, although we'll leave the webinar live for you to type in additional questions. Here's our contact information if you want to reach out to anyone individually. And that just remains then to say thank you to Gail Allen from Kansas City Power and Light, and to Paul Cole of Tendril for joining us today, and to say thank you to you as well for joining us today. Please watch Smart Grid News for the announcement of our next Lessons from the Real World webinar, and I hope to see you back here then.